Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading another textbook, cover to cover. And this is an American history textbook from the year, you got it right, 1940, before we got involved in World War II. This is an American history textbook from a Catholic school, and we're on Chapter 7, Section 2. Our Nation Grows, the Second War of Independence. The war and threatened war. During Jefferson's time, we had a small war. It was with the pirates of Tripoli. Pirates are robbers who stop ships. Tripoli is a country in the northern Africa and the Mediterranean Sea. The pirates of Tripoli sometimes captured our ships and made slaves of our sailors. President Jefferson sent a fleet to bombard the city of Tripoli. This frightened the ruler, who was glad to make peace. France and England were fighting a terrible war at this time. It looked as though we might be drawn into it at any time. Both countries were committing crimes against our ships and our seamen. Jefferson did not believe that the United States should go to war. He did want to do something to show disapproval of these things the countries were doing to the Americans. So a new law was passed known as the Embargo Act. An order forbidding ships to leave or enter ports is an embargo. This act forbade American ships to leave our ports. In this way, our ships would escape being fired upon or captured. Jefferson also hoped by this law to cut off food supplies from England and from France. The Embargo Act was bad. It ruined our trade. Those who hated it spelled it backwards and called it the "Oh, Grab Me" Act. I don't get it. The Embargo Act was replaced by another law. This was the Non-Intercourse Act. Under the law, our ships could trade with all the world, except England or France. Our country would have no intercourse with these countries. There was no good thing that these laws did for us. We could not get manufactured articles from Europe, first because of the Embargo Act and later because of the Non-Intercourse Act. So we started in building factories and making things for ourselves. Today, we are one of the greatest manufacturing nations in the world. Today being 1940. Not today being 2023. Going on 24, where I'm sure you can find statistics that say that we're one of the top manufacturing countries, but you can find statistics that say pretty much anything. Death of Hamilton. Politics sometimes causes bitterness and anger. For example, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson did not believe alike in politics. They were both fine men, and they respected each other. A politician of another kind was Aaron Burr, who was vice president under Jefferson. Was he? I didn't realize that. Burr wanted to be president, but Hamilton opposed him. Hamilton did not trust Aaron Burr. Alexander Hamilton even supported his old foe, Jefferson, rather than let Burr be president. Aaron Burr became angry. He forced Hamilton into fight a duel. This duel, which means a private fight between two people, was fought with pistols. Hamilton was badly wounded and died in a short time. The United States lost very fine statesmen in Alexander Hamilton. Leading up to the War of 1812, Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington, refused a third term as president. James Madison of Virginia was elected. Like Jefferson, he was a Democrat. People during these times in our country was growing very fast. People who were moving west by the hundreds. People in the East were making lots of money and building up businesses. The East was indeed prosperous. American shipyards were turning out fine ships. Our seamen were sailing to Europe and to distant places. We were taking some of the trade from Europe merchants. The terrible wars in Europe continued. England and France were fighting on land and on sea. They were trying to cripple each other. This often injured us. France captured and plundered our ships. England did that, and she did still more. She needed seamen, so she went so far as to impress American sailors from our own ships. To impress the seaman means to take him by force. English ships would stop American ships on the seas and take off any sailors that the English captains thought were Englishmen. English sea captains made that excuse that these men had been born in the British Isles. The English said, "Once an Englishman, always an Englishman." The declaration of war. The United States could not fight both England and France. Which nations would we fight? It was less than 30 years since the Revolution. People still remembered how France had helped us. They still had hard feelings against the old enemy, England. It was also true that England seemed to be hurting us more than France. England was impressing our seamen. It would also be thought that England was trying to get Indians to attack our settlements in the West. Then there was selfish reasons why the United States would choose to fight England. Many of our politicians thought we could easily capture Canada. Although we had plenty of land, we wanted more. Americans were land hungry. There was a band of young men in Congress who wanted war. They were called the War Hawks. By 1812, they were able to bring about a war with England, the war on land. Our first thought was to take Canada. That job seemed easier than it really was. Several times our armies crossed the border. Every time they met with miserable failure. Not only that, but the British turned around and invaded our land. They captured the city of Washington and burned the capital. Then their ships and army made an attack on Baltimore. The Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key was a young Baltimore lawyer. The forts protecting Baltimore were being bombarded by the English fleet. Young Key carried a message under the flag of truce to one of the British ships. A flag of truce is a white flag. In war, it protects the one who carries it from being killed or taken prisoner. The British admiral kept Key on board the ship until after the bombardment was over. All during the night, Key kept watch. He saw shot and shell fall like rain on American fort. As the bombs burst in the air, he could see that the American flag was still flying. Could it last through the night? With the coming dawn, would it still fly high? As he watched, Key put his thoughts into words. These are the words of the Star-Spangled Banner. It will be sung as long as the flag is flown. When morning come, our flag was still there, flying above the fort, as shown in the picture on page 276. The fort was not taken. The British sailed away. The war at sea. And here's the picture. So instead of flying a white flag, they kept the American flag up, meaning they didn't forfeit. The war at sea. During the war, Little Navy did wonderful work. Our finest ship, the Constitution, is shown. To the right of the picture. Okay, yeah. The ship are also called the Old Ironside. After a brief hour's fight, she captured one of the British's finest ships. The great shock to the English, many other American victories followed. Over 300 ships were captured in 1 year by our Navy. The naval battle was lost. The American Chesapeake was beaten by the British Shannon. The Chesapeake was commanded by Captain Lawrence. Captain Lawrence was mortally wounded. His dying words were, "Don't give up the ship." These words have become the motto of the American Navy. Battles on the lakes. Another important naval battle was fought far from the sea. It was fought in Lake Erie. Whichever side could hold Lake Erie could hold the West. Young Oliver Hazard Perry of the American Navy was sent to Lake Erie. He cut down trees from forests and shores and lakes. He built a small fleet. From the masthead of the flagship, Perry flew the words of Lawrence, "Don't give up the ship." His little fleet met British ships in battle. The British fought hard, and Perry's ships started to sink. He was rowed to another vessel. After a bitter battle, the Americans won complete victory. The British fleet was captured. The West was saved for America. The British tried to invade New York from Canada. First, the British fleet had to wipe out the American fleet on Lake Champlain. Captain Thomas MacDonough was American commander. The ship met in battle. It was the British fleet that was wiped out. MacDonough won a fine victory, and the English army went back to Canada. The Battle of New Orleans. The one great American victory took place at New Orleans. It might be called the Battle of Slow News. A peace treaty had already been signed, and the battle was fought. News traveled slowly in those days. It took 6 weeks for news to come from Europe. Had there been a cable or a fast steamer, there would have not been a battle. The Americans at New Orleans were commanded by General Andrew Jackson. His men called him Old Hickory. Hickory was a very strong, hard wood. The men under him were backwoodsmen. They were all good rifle shots. Jackson placed them on high ground. He put bales of cotton in front of them. The British were splendid soldiers. They had fought and beat Napoleon. They marched up against the Americans without fear, but they stood no chance. Jackson's riflemen picked them off. The American victory was complete, and New Orleans was saved. A queer treaty. A treaty of peace was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. It was indeed a queer treaty because it did not mention the cause of the war against England. However, England quit impressing our seamen since the War of 1812. The United States and England have been on friendly terms. The War of 1812 taught us what it taught us. Sometimes we call this our second war of independence. We gained no land by it. Many things remained as before the war. Nothing was decided about England taking our seamen from the ships. Indeed, the British had already stopped impressing our sailors. The war did help us in ways we had not foreseen. It changed some of our ways of living and thinking. It taught us that we must depend upon ourselves. We must manufacture our own goods. We must build our own factories. We must be able to get along with Europe. America for Americans. After the War of 1812, America got right down to work. Times were good. People were busy and happy. The United States felt sure of remaining free and independent. We wanted no more interference of European countries in America. About this time, important changes were taking place in the Spanish colonies in America. These colonies were separated from their mother country. Spain, Mexico was already free. New republics were springing up on every side of South America. The Americans wanted to be free from Canada and Cape Horn. The United States was very glad to see these new free nations. A strong feeling of friendship for the new American republics grew up among other people. The Monroe Doctrine. When the Congress opened in 1823, President James Monroe read an important message. This famous message became known as the Monroe Doctrine. It declared 1. Nations of Europe must not increase their territory in America. 2. they could keep the colonies which they already had. 3. The independence of any country in America must not be interfered with. What this message really meant was that America was for Americans, was to be future policy for the nation in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, that's it. God bless. Bye-bye.